The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds of the lake house, cutting golden strips across the oak table where Caroline and I used to share our coffee. I sat alone now, same chair, same mug, the blue ceramic one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she'd say, running her thumb over the imperfection the way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and looked out at Clearview Lake. The water was mirror still, reflecting the October sky like polished steel. Caroline had chosen this place 32 years ago, walking through rooms that smelled of sawdust and possibility. "This is where we'll grow old," she'd announced, as if the decision had been made by something larger than either of us. She'd been right, of course. We had grown old here. I just hadn't expected to finish the job alone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. I'd built most of the furniture myself back when my hands were steadier, and my back didn't remind me of every ladder I'd climbed, every beam I'd lifted. The dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinners. The built-in bookshelves where Caroline arranged her mysteries and gardening magazines in perfect rows. The bay window seat where she'd curl up with her knitting, needles clicking in rhythm with the rain. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her choices, her laughter. Even 3 years after the funeral, I sometimes caught myself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering. The gravel driveway crunched under tires, a sound I'd grown to recognize from any room in the house. But this engine was unfamiliar, newer, with the quiet hum of something expensive. I moved to the window and saw a black SUV pulling up beside my old Ford. The driver's door opened, and out stepped my son. Ethan looked prosperous. That was the word Caroline would have used. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly pressed, the kind that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in a year. His hair was shorter than I remembered, touched with silver at the temples that made him look distinguished rather than aging. He moved with the confident stride of a man who expected doors to open for him. I hadn't seen him in 8 months, not since that stilted phone call where he'd mentioned needing some space to figure things out with Madison. I'd respected that space, maybe more than I should have. Caroline had always been the bridge between us, translating my practical silences into words Ethan could understand, and his restless ambitions into something I could accept. Without her, we'd defaulted to the awkward politeness of distant relatives. A car door slammed, then another. A woman emerged from the passenger side. Madison was my daughter-in-law, though she'd never seemed comfortable with that title. She wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her blonde hair swept back in one of those casual styles that takes an hour to achieve. Behind her, 2 older figures unfolded from the back seat. I recognized them from the wedding photos that still sat on Caroline's dresser. Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. The 4 of them stood in my driveway like a delegation. Gerald adjusted his sport coat and surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of a man appraising real estate. Patricia clutched a leather handbag and whispered something to Madison that made my daughter-in-law nod with satisfaction. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days. Better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Dad?" Ethan's smile was bright and brittle. "You look good, Ethan." I stepped back to let them pass. "Madison, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." Gerald's handshake was firm, aggressive. Patricia offered her cheek for an air kiss I didn't give. Madison smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. The hallway suddenly felt crowded, filled with perfume and aftershave and the particular tension that comes when people want something they haven't asked for yet. "Coffee?" I offered, because Caroline had trained me to be a host even when I didn't feel like one. "This won't take long," Ethan said, which should have been my first warning. We gathered in the living room, them on the sofa Caroline had reupholstered in soft green fabric, me in my reading chair with its view of the lake. Gerald's eyes roamed the room, taking inventory. He lingered on the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the custom-built entertainment center, the hardwood floors Caroline and I had refinished together one humid summer. "Beautiful place," Patricia said, but her tone suggested she was already planning changes. "It was Caroline's vision," I said. "She had ideas about everything, down to which trees to plant so they'd frame the view just right." Madison shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Caroline. Some people freeze when confronted with grief, as if death might be contagious. "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," Ethan said. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, the posture of a man delivering important news. The future of this place. I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People will fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intended to share. Madison's parents need a place to live, Ethan continued. Their lease is up next month, and with Dad's retirement, he gestured toward Gerald, who nodded gravely, as if confirming a tragedy. We've been looking at senior communities, Gerald said, but the good ones have waiting lists, and the costs. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Their family, Madison added, her voice soft but insistent. And this house has so much space, more than you need, really. The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel them waiting for my response, watching my face for signs of weakness or compliance. But I'd spent 40 years managing construction crews, negotiating with contractors, staring down building inspectors who thought they could intimidate an old man with a clipboard. My expression didn't change. I see, I said finally. We thought, Ethan said, speaking faster now, maybe it would be good for you, too. All this space, all these memories. It might be time to downsize, move somewhere more manageable. Somewhere more manageable, I repeated. There's a nice senior community in Clearwater, Patricia offered brightly. Garden apartments, meal service, activities. You'd have people your own age to socialize with. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who had learned to fish from this dock, who had helped me build the tire swing that still hung from the old oak tree, who'd brought Caroline wildflowers from the meadow behind the house every Mother's Day until he left for college. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who spoke about my life as if it were a problem to be solved. And if I don't want to move? I asked. The question caught them off guard. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances. Madison's smile faltered. Ethan's jaw tightened, in a way I remembered from his teenage years, when he'd been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. Dad, he said, his voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a child. Be reasonable. You're 73 years old. This house is too big, too isolated. What if you fall? What if something happens? What if it does? We worry about you, Madison said, though she'd never shown any evidence of worry before. Living out here alone, with your heart condition, my heart condition is managed. Still, Ethan said, wouldn't it be nice to have people around, to not have to worry about maintenance, yard work, all the things that get harder as we get older? I stood and walked to the window that faced the lake. The morning mist was burning off, revealing the water in all its October glory. Caroline's garden was still blooming. The late roses she'd babied through 15 summers, the Japanese maples she'd planted to turn brilliant red this time of year, the dock where we'd sat countless evenings, watching the sun set behind the pines. This house isn't just a house, I said without turning around. It's Caroline's legacy. It's where we built our life together. She's gone, Dad. Ethan's voice was gentler now, but the words still cut. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. I turned to face them, 4 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for me to crumble, to accept their logic, to make their lives easier by sacrificing my own. The house stays with me, I said quietly. Gerald leaned forward. Richard, let's be practical about this. The upkeep alone must be... The house stays with me, I repeated. Dad. Ethan stood, running a hand through his silver hair. We're trying to help you. Can't you see that? Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for? Everything Caroline and I built together? Move on, Madison said sharply. That's what normal people do. They move on. The room went silent. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable with the naked honesty of it. But Madison had said what they were all thinking. That my grief was inconvenient, my attachment to this place unreasonable, my refusal to accommodate their plans selfish. I appreciate your concern, I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. But this is my home. It will remain my home until I decide otherwise. Ethan's face flushed. And what about family? What about helping people when they need it? You mean the family that visits twice a year? The family that calls on holidays and birthdays if they remember? That's not fair, isn't it? I looked at each of them in turn. When did you last ask how I was doing? Not what I could do for you, but how I was managing? When did you last visit just to spend time together? No one answered. I thought so, I said. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Gerald cleared his throat and checked his watch. Patricia smoothed her skirt and avoided my eyes. Madison's perfectly composed expression had developed small cracks around the edges, but it was Ethan who broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. "Dad, I need you to understand something." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "This isn't a request." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the careful politeness we'd all been maintaining. "Excuse me," I said. "The house," Ethan continued, his voice steadier now, as if he'd found his footing on dangerous ground. "It's not really yours to keep anymore. It's theirs now." He gestured toward Gerald and Patricia, who suddenly looked less like supplicants and more like conquerors surveying their new territory. "It's theirs now," he repeated, and something in his tone, something cold and final, made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. I stared at my son, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a cruel joke that would be retracted in the next breath. But his expression was set, determined, the look of a man who'd made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of the cost. "I see," I said quietly, though I didn't see it all. Not yet. Not the full scope of what was happening, what they'd planned, what they intended to take from me. "We've already spoken to a real estate attorney," Gerald said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "About the transfer process, about the most efficient way to handle the transition." "What transition?" "Your transition to Clearwater Gardens," Patricia said brightly, as if we were discussing vacation plans. "It's really a lovely place. You'll be much happier there." The room seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the back of my chair, feeling suddenly older than my 73 years, more fragile than I'd felt since Caroline's last days in the hospital. "You can't do this," I said. "Actually," Ethan said, pulling a folder from his briefcase, "we can. We've been planning this for months, Dad. Getting all the paperwork in order, making sure everything is legal and above board." He set the folder on the coffee table between us like a gauntlet being thrown down. "All we need is your signature." I looked at the folder without touching it, as if it might burst into flames if I got too close. "And if I refuse to sign?" The four of them exchanged glances again, a silent communication that spoke of rehearsed conversations and predetermined responses. "That would be unfortunate," Gerald said, "for everyone involved." "What does that mean?" "It means," Ethan said, his voice taking on the patient tone again, "that we'd have to explore other options. Medical evaluations, competency hearings, the kind of legal proceedings that are messy and expensive and painful for families." The threat hung in the air between us, polite but unmistakable. Sign over my house voluntarily, or they'd find a way to take it from me anyway. I sat back down in my chair, needing the solid weight of it beneath me. The room was quiet except for the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of wind through the pine trees outside. Caroline's presence seemed to fill the silence, her voice whispering in my memory, "Don't let them break you, Richard. Don't let anyone break what we built." When I looked up, all four faces were watching me expectantly, waiting for me to crumble under the weight of their carefully orchestrated pressure. "No," I said. The word came out stronger than I had expected, carrying 40 years of construction work and 3 years of grief and 7 decades of learning when to bend and when to stand firm. "Dad," Ethan started. "No," I repeated. "I'm not signing anything. I'm not moving anywhere. And I'm not giving up my home to make your lives more convenient." Patricia's mask of politeness finally slipped. "You're being unreasonable. Selfish. Do you have any idea what Gerald and I have been through? What we've sacrificed for our family? About as much idea as you have of what Caroline and I sacrificed to build this place," I said. Gerald stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. We're offering you a perfectly reasonable solution to a difficult situation. You should be grateful." "Grateful," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter, "for being forced out of my own home." "No one's forcing anything," Madison said quickly. "We're just suggesting that it might be time to consider—" "It's theirs now," I said, cutting her off. "Isn't that what you said, Ethan? Not, maybe it should be, or we think it would be better if—" "You said it's theirs now, as if it were already decided, as if my opinion didn't matter." Ethan's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "It doesn't matter, Dad. Not really. Not when you're being irrational about this." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own son, the boy I'd taught to fish and drive and think for himself, calling me irrational for wanting to keep my own home. "I think you should leave," I said quietly. "Dad, let's not— now." They filed out without another word, taking their folder of legal documents and their plans for my future with them. I watched from the window as they climbed back into the SUV, their body language stiff with indignation and disappointment. Gerald gestured angrily as he spoke to Ethan. Patricia shook her head and looked back at the house with the expression of someone who'd been denied something she'd already considered hers. The engine started, gravel crunched, and they were gone, leaving only the scent of expensive perfume and the echo of words that couldn't be taken back. I returned to my chair and sat in the sudden quiet, processing what had just happened. My son had looked me in the eye and told me my house was no longer mine, had threatened me with legal action if I didn't voluntarily surrender everything Caroline and I had worked for, had brought strangers into my home to discuss my future as if I weren't sitting right there. It's theirs now. The words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling, not a question or a suggestion, but a statement of fact. As if the decision had already been made, the papers already filed, the new owners already chosen. But I hadn't signed anything, hadn't agreed to anything. And despite Ethan's confidence, despite Gerald's bluster and Patricia's entitled assumptions, this was still my house. My name on the deed, my mortgage payments that had built the equity, my 40 years of labor that had made the down payment possible. They could threaten and cajole and manipulate all they wanted, but they couldn't take what belonged to me, not unless I let them, and I had no intention of letting them. The silence after they left felt different from my usual solitude. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man who'd chosen to be alone with his memories. It was the hollow echo of something breaking. I sat in my chair for a long time after the SUV disappeared, watching the lake change color as clouds drifted across the sun. The water went from mirror bright to pewter gray to deep blue, the way it had every day for 32 years, indifferent to human drama. Finally, I stood and began the ritual of straightening up, though there wasn't much to straighten. 4 coffee cups that had gone unused, cushions that needed refluffing where unwelcome visitors had sat. I carried the cups to the kitchen and washed them by hand, the way Caroline had taught me. "The dishwasher's for big messes," she'd say. "These little things deserve personal attention." Personal attention. When had I stopped giving Ethan that? The question followed me as I moved through the house, checking windows, adjusting the thermostat, performing the small acts of maintenance that filled my days. In the hallway, I paused before the gallery wall Caroline had created. 3 decades of family photographs arranged with her artist's eye for balance and story. There was Ethan at 2, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, missing his front teeth but grinning as he held up the bass he'd caught off our dock. At 16, lanky and serious in his baseball uniform, the one season he'd played before deciding sports weren't his thing. At 25, nervous and proud in his wedding tuxedo, Madison radiant beside him in her grandmother's dress. I studied that last photo, looking for clues I'd missed at the time. Had there been warning signs? Had Madison's smile been too practiced, too aware of the camera? Had Ethan's hand on her waist been possessive rather than protective? Or was I reading the present into the past, looking for explanations that weren't there? The truth was simpler and more painful. People changed. The boy who'd spent summer afternoons helping me rebuild the dock, who'd listened with genuine interest as I explained the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, who had asked for bedtime stories about the houses I'd built. That boy had grown into a man I barely recognized. When had it started? I traced the timeline backwards, looking for the moment when concern became condescension, when love became obligation. Maybe it was college, when Ethan discovered there was a world beyond Clearview Lake. One where fathers were measured not by the calluses on their hands, but by the numbers in their bank accounts. Maybe it was his first job in the city, where success meant corner offices and client dinners and a lifestyle that required explanations I couldn't provide. Or maybe it was Caroline's diagnosis. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 4 years ago, autumn like this one, when the doctors had used words like aggressive and metastatic and palliative care with the casual precision of carpenters discussing wood grain. Caroline had taken the news with characteristic grace, already planning how to spend whatever time remained. But Ethan, Ethan had looked at me as if I'd somehow failed him, as if a better father would have prevented this, would have found a way to keep death from touching our family. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at Caroline's garden. She'd spent her last good months there, planting bulbs she'd never see bloom, tending roses she'd never smell again. "Promise me you will keep it going," she'd whispered during one of those endless hospital nights. "Promise me something beautiful will still grow here." I'd promised, and I'd kept that promise, teaching myself the difference between annuals and perennials, learning which plants needed deadheading and which should be left alone. The garden still bloomed every spring, a riot of color and fragrance that Caroline had orchestrated from her hospital bed. But Ethan had never asked about it, had never noticed the way I'd preserved every corner exactly as she'd designed it. After the funeral, something had shifted between us. The shared grief I'd expected never materialized. Instead, Ethan had thrown himself into work, into his marriage, into anything that didn't require him to sit with sadness. And I'd retreated into this house, into routines that kept Caroline's presence alive, into a solitude that felt safer than risking more loss. We'd become strangers who shared a name and a history, but no common language for what came next. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be Ethan calling to apologize, to say he'd been wrong, to ask if we could try again. But the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Dalton, this is Patricia Monroe." I should have hung up. Instead, I found myself saying, "Mrs. Monroe." I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence rather than charm. I wanted to follow up on our conversation this morning. There's nothing to follow up on. I think there might be. You see, Richard, may I call you Richard? I understand this is difficult. Change always is, especially for people of our generation. Our generation. As if we were peers, as if her 70-odd years somehow gave her the right to speak for mine. But sometimes, she continued, what feels like loss is actually opportunity, freedom, a chance to discover what comes next. I've discovered what comes next, I said. It's staying right here, in this big, empty house. Richard, be honest with yourself. When was the last time you used the guest bedrooms, the formal dining room, the study? You're rattling around in all that space like a man who's forgotten how to live. The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. I did rattle around sometimes, moving from room to room like a ghost haunting his own life. There were spaces I barely entered anymore. Caroline's sewing room, where her half-finished quilt still waited on the cutting table. The guest bedrooms we'd prepared so hopefully for grandchildren who'd never materialized. The study where I used to pay bills and plan home improvement projects that no longer seemed necessary. But emptiness wasn't the same as purposelessness. This house held 32 years of marriage, 3 years of mourning, and a lifetime of memories that couldn't be measured in square footage. "Mrs. Monroe," I said, "with all due respect, you don't know me well enough to tell me how to live." "No, but I know Ethan, and I know how much he worries about you. We all do." Ethan worried enough to visit twice in the past year. If that's his definition of concern, I'm not impressed. Silence stretched across the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost its practiced warmth. "You're being selfish, Richard. Family means compromise. It means putting the needs of the group ahead of your own wants." "Whose family? Yours or mine? We're all family now. That's what marriage means." "Marriage," I said slowly, "means a lot of things. But it doesn't mean one family gets to absorb another like a hostile takeover. I don't think you understand the situation. Gerald and I aren't asking for charity. We're willing to pay rent, to contribute to utilities, to help with maintenance. This could be mutually beneficial. You want to be tenants in my house? We want to be family, real family, the kind that supports each other." I walked to the living room window, looking out at the dock, where Caroline and I had shared morning coffee for 32 summers, where I still shared it with her memory every day the weather allowed. "The answer is no," I said. "Richard, the answer is no. Don't call here again." I hung up and immediately unplugged the phone from the wall. The sudden silence was profound, almost sacred. Outside, a red-winged blackbird landed on the feeder Caroline had hung from the oak tree. It pecked at the seeds I'd refilled that morning, then flew away, leaving the feeder swaying in the October breeze. The afternoon passed slowly. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. I tried to watch television, but nothing held my attention. Finally, I went to the garage and pulled out my tools, spreading them on the workbench Caroline had bought me for our 20th anniversary. The familiar weight of the hammer, the precise edges of the chisels, the satisfying click of the tape measure, these things still made sense when nothing else did. I found a piece of oak I'd been saving for the right project and began to plane it smooth, losing myself in the rhythm of the work. Wood didn't lie. It didn't manipulate or cajole or guilt you into doing things you didn't want to do. It simply was what it was, revealing its true nature only under careful, patient attention. As the shavings curled away from the blade, I thought about Ethan's childhood visits to this same garage, how he'd stand on a step stool, tongue poking out in concentration, as he helped me sand a board or hold a piece steady while I measured, how his eyes had lit up when I'd let him use the drill press for the first time, his small hands steady under my guidance. "Why do you build things, Dad?" he'd asked once, maybe 8 years old, covered in sawdust from head to toe. "Because building something that lasts feels good," I'd told him. "Because when you make something with your hands, you put a piece of yourself into it. Long after you're gone, that piece remains." He'd nodded solemnly, as if filing away wisdom for future use. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that lesson. Or maybe he'd learned a different one, that things built by hand could be dismissed, discarded, sold off when they became inconvenient. The light was fading when I finally put away my tools. I'd accomplished nothing productive, had simply moved wood shavings from one place to another, but my hands felt steadier, my breathing calmer. Sometimes the point wasn't accomplishment. Sometimes it was just the reminder that you still had purpose, still had skills that mattered. I made myself a simple dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like childhood. Caroline would have added herbs to the soup, maybe a side salad to balance the richness of the cheese. But Caroline wasn't here, and I was learning to be okay with simple things done simply. As darkness settled over the lake, I sat in my chair with a cup of coffee, watching the lights of distant houses flicker on across the water. Other families were settling in for the evening, children doing homework at kitchen tables, couples discussing their days, grandparents reading bedtime stories over video calls with faraway grandchildren. I wondered what Ethan and Madison were doing right now. Were they strategizing their next approach, researching assisted living facilities they could recommend? Or had they simply written me off as a stubborn old man who'd eventually come around when loneliness wore down his resistance? They didn't understand that loneliness wasn't my enemy anymore. I'd made peace with it, had learned to distinguish between being alone and being lonely. Caroline's presence still filled this house in ways that had nothing to do with physical occupation. Her books still lined the shelves, her plants still thrived under my care, her voice still whispered in the settling of timbers she'd helped me choose. This wasn't just a house, it was a marriage made manifest, love translated into lumber and stone and glass. Every room held stories only I remembered now, the way she'd hummed while cooking, the sound of her typewriter when she was working on her newsletter for the garden club, the squeak of the floorboard outside our bedroom that had warned us when teenage Ethan was trying to sneak out after curfew. Ethan wanted me to trade all of that for the sterile comfort of an assisted living facility, where every surface would be sanitized and every memory would belong to someone else, where I'd be Richard from 304 instead of the man who'd built a life with his own hands. I understood his motivations, even sympathized with them to a degree. Watching your parent age was frightening. Imagining them alone, potentially in need of help that might not come, was a burden no child should have to carry. But his solution, removing me from everything familiar, everything meaningful, wasn't protection, it was erasure. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, its sound echoing through rooms that had heard that chime nearly 12,000 times since Caroline and I had bought it at an estate sale in Millbrook. We'd argued about the price. She thought it was too much, I thought it was too beautiful to pass up. She'd been wrong about the money, I'd been right about the beauty, but we'd both been right about its importance to our home. That clock had measured our marriage in quarter-hour increments, had marked the passage of days both ordinary and extraordinary. It had chimed through birthday parties and Christmas mornings, through quiet Sunday afternoons and sleepless nights when one of us was sick. It had counted down Caroline's final weeks with mechanical precision, indifferent to our prayers for more time. Now it measured my solitude, and I found comfort in its constancy. Some things endured, some things kept faith even when people didn't. I finished my coffee and began the evening routine, checking the locks, turning off lights, setting the automatic timer for the porch light that would come on at dawn. In the bedroom, I paused before Caroline's dresser, where our wedding photo still sat in its silver frame. We looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. She wore her grandmother's dress and the pearl necklace I'd given her for our first anniversary. I wore a rented tux and an expression of stunned joy that I'd managed to convince this remarkable woman to spend her life with me. "They want me to leave," I said to her image. "Our son wants me to give up everything we built together." The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but I could imagine what she'd say if she could. Caroline had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes mattered. She'd fought the insurance company when they'd tried to deny coverage for my heart surgery. She'd fought the county when they'd wanted to rezone our road for commercial development. She'd fought her cancer with grace and determination until the very end. "Fight," I could almost hear her whisper. "Don't let them take what's ours." I turned off the bedside lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure from Ethan and his in-laws. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had chosen together. It would have to be enough, because it was all I had left. I woke before dawn, not from any sound or disturbance, but from the strange clarity that sometimes comes after a sleepless night spent thinking. The kind of clarity that cuts through confusion, like a blade through soft wood, revealing the grain beneath. I lay in the darkness for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe around me, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. In construction, you learn that every project begins with a foundation. You survey the land, you test the soil, you calculate load-bearing requirements. Only fools start building without understanding what they're working with. Ethan and his in-laws had made their opening move, but they'd revealed their hand too early, shown me exactly what kind of ground we were standing on. They wanted me gone. Everything else, the concern for my welfare, the talk of family obligation, the carefully constructed arguments about practicality, was window dressing. The truth was simpler. I was an obstacle to their comfort, an inconvenience to be managed. I rose and made coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, my movements automatic but purposeful. Through the kitchen window, the lake was invisible in the darkness, but I could hear the gentle lap of water against the dock, the sound that had been our lullaby for 32 years. By the time the sun crested the pine trees, I was sitting at Caroline's desk with a yellow legal pad, making lists. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "What I know." Underneath, I began cataloging facts with the methodical precision I'd once used for project estimates. Ethan's visit had been coordinated, planned. They'd brought legal documents they expected me to sign on the spot. Patricia's follow-up call had been immediate, suggesting they'd anticipated resistance and prepared a secondary approach. The talk of competency hearings and medical evaluations hadn't been threats made in anger. They'd been warnings about predetermined strategies. On the second page, what I own. The house, free and clear, I had made the final mortgage payment 6 years ago, a surprise for Caroline's 65th birthday. 43 acres of lakefront property, worth considerably more now than when we'd bought it. The contents, furniture I'd built, art Caroline had chosen, a lifetime of accumulated possessions that had meaning beyond their monetary value. My savings, modest but sufficient, the result of 40 years of careful planning and conservative investments. On the third page, what I can do. Here, I paused, pen hovering over paper. In my younger days, I might have relied on physical intimidation, the implied threat of a man who had spent decades working with his hands. But I was 73 now, and besides, that wasn't who Caroline had married. She'd fallen in love with a builder, not a destroyer. I could be smarter than they expected. Ethan saw me as a relic, a man clinging to the past because he couldn't adapt to the present. Let him think that. Let them all think that. Underestimation was a gift I could use. At 8 o'clock, I called Marcus Henley. Marcus had been my lawyer for 25 years, handling everything from property acquisitions to contract disputes to Caroline's will. He was my age, maybe a year or two younger, with the kind of sharp mind that had served him well in a career built on paying attention to details others missed. More importantly, he was a friend who'd known Caroline, who understood what this house meant to both of us. "Richard," he said when his secretary put me through, "how are you holding up?" "I need to see you," I said without preamble. "Today, if possible." It's about the house. What about the house? Someone wants to take it from me. There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. Can you be here at 10? Marcus's office occupied the top floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence rather than awe. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with legal texts that looked well-used rather than decorative. His desk was cherrywood, probably built sometime in the 1940s, scarred but dignified. I told him everything: Ethan's visit, the in-laws' demands, Patricia's follow-up call, the folder of legal documents I'd refused to sign. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the same yellow legal pads I favored. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "They can't force you to sell," he said. "Not legally. The house is yours, titled in your name alone since Caroline's passing, but that doesn't mean they can't make your life difficult." "How?" "Emotional pressure, financial pressure, if they can find leverage. Adult children have been known to claim their parents are no longer competent to make decisions about their own welfare." The words hit like a physical blow. "They'd try to have me declared incompetent? I'm not saying they will. I'm saying it's a tool people sometimes use when other methods fail. It's hard to prove and harder to stick, especially if the alleged incompetent person has good legal representation." He smiled slightly. "Which you do." "What do I need to do?" "Document everything. Every conversation, every phone call, every interaction. If they're planning something more aggressive than family guilt, they'll show their hand eventually. We want to be ready." Marcus opened a file drawer and pulled out several forms. "We should also update your documentation. Power of attorney, healthcare directives, living will. Make sure everything is current and crystal clear. If someone challenges your competency, we want bulletproof evidence that you've been thinking clearly about your future." I spent the next hour going through paperwork, updating beneficiaries, clarifying my wishes for medical care and end-of-life decisions. It felt morbid, planning for my own decline, but also strangely liberating. These were my choices, my decisions about my own life, no one else's. "One more thing," Marcus said as we finished. "Have you considered making it harder for them to contest your will or challenge your property ownership?" "How?" "A trust. Transfer ownership of the house to a revocable living trust with you as trustee. It accomplishes the same thing as outright ownership. You control everything during your lifetime, but it makes the property much harder to challenge or manipulate after your death." "And if I want to sell?" "As trustee, you can do whatever you want with trust property. The only difference is the legal structure. Think of it as insurance." I authorized Marcus to draw up the preliminary paperwork and left his office feeling something I hadn't felt in months: prepared. The afternoon was crisp, the kind of October day that made you grateful to be alive. I drove home slowly, taking the long way around the lake, watching the light play across water that was beginning to show the first hints of winter's approach. Back at the house, I began implementing Marcus's advice. I found a composition book in Caroline's desk drawer. She'd used it for garden planning and started a detailed log. Time and date of Ethan's visit. Exact quotes when I could remember them. Patricia's phone call, word for word. The folder of legal documents they'd wanted me to sign. As I wrote, patterns emerged. This hadn't been a spontaneous family intervention. It had been planned, coordinated, orchestrated. Gerald's comment about speaking to a real estate attorney suggested they'd been working on this for weeks, maybe months. The timing of their visit, shortly after the morning when I'd be alone and unprepared, showed tactical thinking. The phone rang again around 3 o'clock. This time, I was ready. "Hello, Richard. This is Gerald Monroe." His voice carried the forced joviality of a man trying to repair damaged negotiations. I said nothing, waiting for him to fill the silence. "I hope you'll forgive the direct approach, but Patricia and I wanted to reach out personally. We feel there may have been some misunderstanding this morning." "No misunderstanding," I said. "You want my house. I'm not giving it to you." "Now, Richard, that's not quite— Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot. What if we could arrange a more formal discussion, maybe with all parties represented?" "All parties represented?" "Legal counsel, financial advisors, people who could help us find a solution that works for everyone." I almost laughed. They were escalating, bringing in professionals to intimidate an old man who didn't understand his own best interests. But they'd made a tactical error. They'd assumed I was fighting alone. "Mr. Monroe," I said, "if you want to discuss this house again, you can contact my attorney, Marcus Henley. He'll be handling all future communications about my property." The silence on the other end was gratifying. When Gerald spoke again, the false joviality was gone. "I see. Well, I hope you'll reconsider, Richard, for everyone's sake. Good afternoon, Mr. Monroe." I hung up and immediately called Marcus to give him a heads up. Then I returned to my documentation, adding Gerald's call and his veiled threat about arranging more formal discussions. The next 3 days brought a parade of visitors, each one confirming my growing suspicion that Ethan and his in-laws were conducting a campaign rather than making casual inquiries. First came a real estate agent on Thursday morning, a young woman with aggressive enthusiasm who claimed to be in the neighborhood and wondered if I might be interested in a market evaluation. I told her I wasn't selling and sent her away, but not before noting her license plate number and the name of her agency. Friday brought a representative from Clearwater Gardens, the assisted living facility Patricia had mentioned. He had brochures and floor plans and a practice speech about the benefits of active senior living. When I asked who had given him my information, he mentioned that a family member had requested materials on my behalf. Saturday's visitor was more subtle, a man who claimed to be conducting a survey about home safety for elderly residents. He wanted to know about my daily routines, my medical conditions, whether I had family nearby who checked on me regularly. I answered his questions politely while mentally adding every detail to my growing file. Each encounter felt scripted, coordinated. They were building a case, gathering evidence to support whatever legal action they were planning. The real estate evaluation would establish the property's value. The assisted living brochures would show that they'd researched alternatives. The safety survey would document concerns about my ability to live independently, but they'd made another mistake. They'd assumed I wouldn't recognize what they were doing. Sunday evening, I called Marcus at home. "They're building a competency case," I told him. "Real estate agents, assisted living facilities, home safety surveys, all claiming that family members requested their services." "Smart," Marcus said, "and stupid. Smart because they're being systematic about it. Stupid because they're leaving a paper trail that proves premeditation. How are you feeling about all this?" The question caught me off guard. How was I feeling? Angry, certainly. Betrayed, absolutely. But underneath those emotions was something else, a kind of grim satisfaction. For the first time since Caroline's death, I had a purpose beyond mere survival. I had an enemy worth fighting. "I'm feeling ready," I said. "Good, because I've got the trust documents ready for your review. Can you come in Monday morning?" Monday morning brought frost on the windows and the first real bite of winter in the air. I dressed carefully, not the work clothes I usually wore around the house, but slacks and a button-down shirt, the kind of outfit a competent, clear-thinking man would choose. If they were watching, if they were documenting my behavior, I wanted to present the image of someone fully in control of his faculties. Marcus's secretary led me to his office, where the trust documents waited in a neat folder on his desk. The legal language was dense, but Marcus walked me through every clause, every provision, every protection the trust would provide. "Once you sign these," he said, "the house belongs to the Richard Dalton Revocable Living Trust. You're the trustee, which means you control everything. But if someone challenges your competency as an individual, they can't touch the trust property without going through a probate court. And that's harder, much harder. They'd need to prove not just that you're incompetent, but that the trust itself was created under incompetent circumstances. Since we're documenting your mental state thoroughly right now, that would be nearly impossible." I signed the documents with a steady hand, feeling each signature like armor being fitted into place. The house was still mine, but now it was protected in ways that would make my adversary's plans much more difficult to execute. "One more thing," Marcus said as we finished. "I want you to consider having a complete physical and mental health evaluation. Not because I think there's anything wrong with you, but because I want current medical documentation that proves beyond doubt that you're perfectly competent." He gave me the name of a doctor who specialized in geriatric assessments, someone whose opinion would carry weight in any legal proceeding. I made the appointment for the following week. Driving home, I felt the satisfaction of a builder who had just reinforced a foundation before the storm hit. They could bring their real estate agents and their assisted living brochures and their safety surveys. They could threaten and manipulate and scheme all they wanted. But they were no longer fighting a grieving widower who could be easily intimidated. They were fighting someone who'd spent 40 years building things to last. Someone who understood that the strongest structures were the ones with solid foundations and careful planning. Someone who was just getting started. The grandfather clock chimed noon as I pulled into my driveway. I sat in the truck for a moment, looking at the house Caroline and I had built together, feeling the weight of new purpose settling into my bones. Ethan had said it was theirs now. He was about to learn how wrong he could be. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after my meeting with Marcus. I was in the kitchen, scrambling eggs that would taste like cardboard, no matter how carefully I cooked them. Grief had a way of leaching flavor from everything, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Dalton, this is Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office. We've had someone calling about your medical records, claiming to be your son. Since we can't release any information without your written consent, we wanted to verify with you directly." The fork slipped from my hand, clattering against the plate. What kind of information were they asking for? Mental health evaluations, cognitive assessments, any records related to memory or decision-making capacity. The caller was quite persistent, said the family was concerned about your ability to live independently. I thanked the receptionist and hung up, my breakfast forgotten. They weren't just building a case, they were actively investigating my private medical information. The violation felt profound, like someone had been rifling through my most personal possessions. But it also told me something important. They were desperate enough to take risks, to leave trails that could be traced back to them. I called Marcus immediately. "They're trying to access my medical records," I told him, claiming family concern about my mental state. "That's actually good news for us," Marcus said. "Medical privacy laws are strict. If they're attempting to obtain records without authorization, that's potentially illegal. It also shows their hand. They're definitely planning a competency challenge. What do I do?" "Document everything. Get the name of whoever called, the exact questions they asked, the time and date. And Richard, I think it's time we got proactive about this." That afternoon, I drove to Dr. Mitchell's office and signed forms, authorizing her to speak with Marcus about any future inquiries. Then I visited my bank, my insurance company, and the county clerk's office, alerting them all to watch for unauthorized requests for information about my accounts or property. Each stop reinforced the same unsettling truth. Ethan and his in-laws were conducting a comprehensive investigation into my life, looking for any weakness they could exploit. But they'd made another mistake. They'd assumed I would remain passive, that I wouldn't fight back with the same systematic approach they were using against me. Wednesday brought a visitor I hadn't expected, Tom Henderson from the hardware store, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the uncomfortable expression of a man bearing bad news. "Richard," he said when I opened the door, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but someone was asking questions about you yesterday, and I thought you should know." I invited him in, pouring coffee while he struggled with how to begin. "Fellow came into the store around closing time," Tom said finally. "Well-dressed, claimed to be conducting some kind of family wellness survey. Wanted to know about your shopping habits, whether you seemed confused or forgetful, if I'd noticed any changes in your behavior." "What did you tell him?" "Told him you were sharp as ever, paid your bills on time, never seemed anything but competent to me. But Richard, it struck me as odd. Who conducts surveys like that?" "Someone building a case that I'm not capable of taking care of myself." Tom's eyebrows rose. "Family trouble?" I gave him a brief summary of the situation, watching his expression shift from concern to anger. "That's your son doing this?" "My son and his in-laws. They want the house." Tom shook his head. "I've known you 15 years, Richard. You're one of the most level-headed men I've ever met. If someone's trying to prove otherwise, they're either lying or they don't know you at all." After Tom left, I added his information to my growing file. The investigators' visit to the hardware store meant they were canvassing local businesses, probably building a profile of my daily activities and mental state. But Tom's account also gave me something valuable, evidence that their inquiries were being met with skepticism by people who actually knew me. Thursday morning brought a call from Janet Morrison at the bank. "Richard, I wanted to let you know that someone called asking about your account activity. They claimed to be your son, said they were concerned about unusual spending patterns or signs of financial mismanagement." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, of course. We can't discuss account details with anyone but the account holder. But I thought you should know. The caller seemed surprised when I refused to provide information, like he expected it would be simple to get what he wanted. I thanked Janet and hung up, feeling a mixture of gratitude and rage. Gratitude for the professionals who were protecting my privacy, rage at the systematic invasion Ethan was orchestrating. But the call also revealed something important about their strategy. They weren't just planning to claim I was mentally incompetent. They were building a case for financial incompetence as well. Unusual spending patterns, mismanagement of accounts, the kind of evidence that would support a guardianship petition. That afternoon, I drove to Henderson's Hardware and bought materials I didn't need. A new circular saw, expensive hand tools, premium lumber for non-existent projects. I paid with cash and made sure Mom rang up each purchase separately, creating a paper trail of major expenditures that would look suspicious to someone who didn't know the context. Then I drove to the bank and made a large withdrawal, not enough to raise automatic flags, but enough to show up in my account activity as unusual behavior. I deposited the money in a savings account at a different bank across town, creating the appearance of financial confusion while actually protecting my assets from potential seizure. If they wanted evidence of erratic behavior, I'd give them evidence. But it would be evidence I controlled, behavior I could explain, actions that would make sense once the full context was revealed. Friday brought the most brazen move yet, a visit from someone claiming to be from Adult Protective Services. The woman at my door was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the earnest expression of someone who genuinely believed she was helping. She introduced herself as Linda Walsh and explained that they'd received reports about my welfare. What kind of reports? I asked. Concerns about your living situation, your ability to maintain this property safely, questions about your mental and physical health. The caller seemed very worried about you. Did this caller give a name? I'm afraid I can't share that information, but they provided specific details about your circumstances that suggest genuine concern. I invited her in, recognizing this as another opportunity to demonstrate my competence. Linda spent 45 minutes walking through the house, asking questions about my daily routine, my medical care, my support network. She examined the refrigerator full of fresh food, the clean and organized rooms, the evidence of regular maintenance and upkeep. Mr. Dalton, she said as we finished, I have to say, everything here looks perfectly normal. Your house is clean and well maintained. You appear to be in good health, and you're clearly capable of caring for yourself. Then we're done here? I'll file a report stating that I found no evidence of self-neglect or unsafe living conditions. Whoever made the initial report, well, their concerns appear to be unfounded. After she left, I called Marcus immediately. APS found no problems, I told him. Complete exoneration. Excellent. And stupid of them to involve APS this early. It shows they're desperate, and it gives us official documentation that you're perfectly capable of independent living. What's next? We wait for their next move, but, Richard, I think it's time to consider some offensive action of our own. That evening, I sat in my study with the file I'd been building, reviewing 3 weeks of documentation. The pattern was clear. A systematic campaign to gather evidence of my incompetence, conducted with increasing desperation as each avenue proved fruitless. But desperation made people reckless, and reckless people made mistakes. I thought about Caroline, about the way she'd approach problems with methodical patience. Don't react, she used to say when I got frustrated with difficult clients or stubborn contradictors. Plan, let them show you what they're really made of, then respond accordingly. Ethan and his in-laws had shown me exactly what they were made of. Now it was time to respond. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began planning my counterattack. Not revenge, that was beneath me and beneath Caroline's memory, but justice, protection, the kind of systematic defense that would make their schemes not just difficult, but impossible. At the top of the page I wrote, what they don't know. The list that followed was longer than I had expected. They didn't know about the trust, which had already moved the house beyond their reach. They didn't know about my documentation, which recorded every move they'd made. They didn't know about the medical evaluation I'd scheduled, which would provide current proof of my mental competence. They didn't know about Marcus, who was preparing for legal challenges they didn't realize were coming. Most importantly, they didn't know that their campaign of intimidation had accomplished exactly the opposite of what they'd intended. Instead of weakening my resolve, it had given me purpose. Instead of isolating me, It had shown me who my real allies were. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times as I finished my planning. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the lake with white that would be gone by morning. Winter was coming, but I was ready for it. I'd spent 40 years building things that could withstand storms. Now I was building something else. A defense against people who thought they could take what belonged to me simply because they wanted it more than they respected me. They were about to learn what it meant to fight someone who'd spent a lifetime making things last. The snow continued to fall as I turned off the lights and headed to bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new schemes, new attempts to undermine my autonomy. But tonight, for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt truly awake, alert, ready for whatever came next. The real fight was just beginning. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, early enough to suggest urgency, but late enough to catch me after I'd had my coffee and cleared my head. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. Dr. Patricia Kovac, the neuropsychologist Marcus had recommended for my cognitive assessment. "Mr. Dalton, I wanted to personally deliver your test results. Your cognitive function is excellent, better than many people 20 years younger. If someone is suggesting you're not capable of making your own decisions, they're either misinformed or deliberately misleading." I thanked her and hung up, feeling vindicated but not surprised. The 2-day battery of tests had been thorough but not difficult. Memory exercises, problem-solving tasks, spatial reasoning puzzles. Dr. Kovac had been impressed by my performance, particularly my ability to recall specific details from decades past, while maintaining sharp focus on complex present-day scenarios. But the real value of the evaluation wasn't in proving what I already knew about my mental state. It was in creating documented evidence that would demolish any competency challenge before it could gain traction. I was still processing this small victory when Marcus called with bigger news. "Richard, I've been doing some research into your son's situation. Would you be interested in knowing what I found?" "What kind of research?" "The public kind. Court records, business filings, property transfers, all perfectly legal and available to anyone who knows where to look." An hour later, I was sitting in Marcus's office, staring at a folder full of documents that painted a picture I hadn't expected. Ethan's consulting business was struggling. 3 major clients had terminated contracts in the past 6 months, citing missed deadlines and substandard work. His mortgage was 3 payments behind, with foreclosure proceedings scheduled to begin within 60 days. Most damaging of all was a civil judgment from a former business partner, demanding repayment of a $40,000 loan that had gone into default. "Your son isn't just wanting your house," Marcus said quietly. "He's desperate for it. This isn't about finding a convenient place for his in-laws to live. This is about survival." The revelation hit me like cold water. Ethan's urgency, his willingness to threaten and manipulate, his systematic campaign to undermine my competence. It all made sense now. He wasn't being cruel for the sake of cruelty. He was drowning financially, and my house represented his only life preserver. "How bad is it?" I asked. "Bad enough that he is probably facing bankruptcy if he can't find a major cash infusion soon. Your property is worth what? 700,000? 800? That would solve all his problems and leave him with money to start over." I sat back in my chair, processing this new understanding of my son's motivations. Part of me felt sympathy. Watching your child struggle was every parent's nightmare. But a larger part felt something colder, confirmation that his concern for my welfare had been entirely fabricated. "What does this mean for us?" "Sissy, something for us," I asked. "It means he's not going to give up. Desperate people take desperate measures, but it also means we understand his timeline now. He can't wait for you to come around naturally. He needs resolution quickly, before his creditors lose patience. So, what do we do?" Marcus smiled, the expression of a chess player who'd just seen his opponent's entire strategy. "We make him play our game instead of his." That afternoon, I implemented the first phase of what Marcus called our proactive defense. I drove to 3 different banks in neighboring towns, opening small checking accounts at each one. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create the appearance of financial activity that would confuse anyone trying to track my assets. Then I visited an estate planning attorney Marcus had recommended, a woman named Helen Crawford, who specialized in protecting elderly clients from family exploitation. We spent 2 hours creating additional legal barriers, updated powers of attorney that required multiple witnesses, healthcare directives that specified exactly who could and couldn't make medical decisions on my behalf, and financial safeguards that would require court approval for any major transactions. Your son may try to claim you're not competent to make these decisions, Helen warned, as we signed the documents. But the timing works in our favor. We're creating these protections while you're demonstrably competent, which makes them much harder to challenge later. By the end of the week, I'd transformed myself from a vulnerable target into a fortress. My assets were protected, my medical competence documented, my legal position strengthened beyond anything Ethan and his allies had anticipated. But the real test came on Saturday morning when I found a man in an expensive suit standing at my front door, briefcase in hand. Mr. Dalton, James Crawford, real estate assessor with Hartwell and Associates. I understand you might be considering putting your property on the market. The words hit me like a slap. I hadn't contacted any real estate companies, hadn't spoken to anyone about selling, which meant someone else had. Who told you that? I asked through the first screen door. Your son, Ethan Dalton. He hired us to provide a preliminary assessment, standard procedure when families are exploring their options. I studied Crawford's face, noting the practiced confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. But there was something else there too, a slight discomfort that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced about the legitimacy of his assignment. Mr. Crawford, I said, I'm not selling my house, I haven't authorized any assessment, and I'd like you to leave my property immediately. His professional smile faltered. I understand these decisions can be emotional, sir, but your son seemed quite concerned about your situation here. Perhaps we could just take a quick look around? You can look around from the road, I said, closing the door. Through the window, and I watched him walk back to his silver BM, making notes on a clipboard. He sat in the car for several minutes, probably calling Ethan to report his failure, but he'd served a purpose I doubt he intended. He'd shown me that Ethan was no longer content to wait for me to capitulate voluntarily. He was actively working to force my hand. I called Marcus immediately. He's escalating, I told him, hiring assessors without my knowledge or consent. Actually, that's good news for us. It shows premeditation. This isn't a loving son concerned about his father's welfare. This is someone with a specific agenda. Keep documenting everything. Monday brought another escalation. I was working in my garage, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, when my neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on the side door. She was in her 80s, a retired teacher who had lived across the lake for 15 years, and she looked troubled. Richard, I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you know someone's been asking questions about you? I set down my wrench and gave her my full attention. What kind of questions? A young woman came to my door yesterday, said she was conducting a survey about neighborhood safety for elderly residents, but most of her questions were about you specifically, whether I'd noticed changes in your behavior, if you seemed confused or forgetful, whether family members checked on you regularly. What did you tell her? I told her you were the most capable person on this lake, that you kept your property better than people half your age, and that whoever was suggesting otherwise didn't know what they were talking about. Mrs. Patterson's eyes flashed with indignation. I also told her that if someone was genuinely concerned about your welfare, they'd be talking to you directly instead of interrogating your neighbors. I thanked Mrs. Patterson and walked her back to her car, but her information left me unsettled. They weren't just investigating my medical and financial records anymore. They were building a community profile, gathering testimony from people who might be called to support a competency hearing. But they'd made another tactical error. They had assumed my neighbors would see what they wanted them to see, an isolated old man whose family was rightfully concerned about his decline. Instead, they'd found people who knew me, who respected me, who were insulted by the implication that I needed their surveillance and pity. That evening, I called 5 more neighbors, ostensibly to check on them after the recent cold snap. Each conversation naturally turned to the mysterious surveys and safety assessments that had been conducted throughout our small community. Each neighbor expressed the same combination of confusion and annoyance at being asked to evaluate my competence. Richard, said Bob Martinez, who lived 2 houses down, I don't know what kind of family dispute you've got going on, but whoever's running this investigation is barking up the wrong tree. You're the guy we call when we need real advice about home repairs or property maintenance. Anyone who thinks you're not sharp enough to handle your own affairs obviously doesn't know you very well. By Tuesday, I had documentation of at least 8 separate attempts to gather negative information about my mental state and living situation. Not one had produced the evidence Ethan and his allies were seeking, but their persistence told me something important. They weren't planning to abandon their strategy. They were planning to accelerate it. Wednesday morning brought confirmation of my suspicions in the form of a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. The letterhead was impressive. Brennan, Walsh, and Associates, with offices in 3 cities and a client list that included several prominent families I'd heard of. The letter was carefully worded, full of legal language that obscured its real meaning, but the core message was clear. They represented interested parties who were concerned about my welfare and my ability to manage my property safely. They were requesting a meeting to discuss options for ensuring appropriate care and oversight of my living situation. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my anger build with each pass. This wasn't a family intervention anymore. This was a legal assault conducted by professionals who specialized in separating elderly people from their assets. I called Marcus and read him the letter, word for word. "They're bringing in the heavy artillery," he said when I finished. "Brennan, Walsh, and Associates don't handle family disputes. They handle estate litigation and guardianship proceedings. This means they're confident enough in their case to invest serious money in professional legal help." What does that tell us? It tells us they think they can win. And it tells us we need to be ready for a fight that's going to be more serious than anything we've prepared for so far. Are we ready? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. We're ready for the legal fight. The question is whether you're ready for what this is going to cost you emotionally, because once this moves into the courtroom, there's no going back. Your relationship with your son will never be the same. I looked out my kitchen window at the lake, where ice was beginning to form along the shoreline. Winter was coming, and with it the kind of cold that tested everything. Houses, hearts, relationships that had seemed solid but had never faced real stress. "It's already not the same," I said finally. "The son I raised wouldn't have done any of this. The question isn't whether I can salvage a relationship that's already gone. The question is whether I can protect what Caroline and I built together." "Then we're ready," Marcus said. "And Richard, they have no idea what they're walking into." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and began planning my response to Brennan, Walsh, and Associates. Not a defensive reaction, but an offensive strategy that would show them exactly what kind of opponent they'd chosen to take on. The grandfather clock chimed noon, its sound echoing through rooms that had witnessed 32 years of marriage, 3 years of widowhood, and now this. The final test of everything I'd learned about building things that could withstand any storm. They wanted a legal fight. They were about to get one, but it wouldn't be the fight they were expecting. The meeting request came on a Friday afternoon, delivered not through legal channels, but in a phone call from Madison. Her voice carried a brittleness I'd never heard before, the sound of someone operating under enormous stress. "Richard, we need to talk. All of us. Ethan thinks, we think, there's been a misunderstanding about our intentions. Can we meet somewhere neutral, maybe the Millbrook Inn, tomorrow at 1? I agreed, recognizing this for what it was, a final attempt at negotiation before the legal warfare began in earnest. They were offering me one last chance to surrender voluntarily before they brought out the heavy artillery. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing artillery of my own. Saturday morning, I dressed carefully in my best suit, the charcoal wool one Caroline had insisted I buy for our 40th anniversary. If this was going to be a formal confrontation, I'd present myself as the competent, dignified man I'd always been, not the declining elder they needed me to appear to be. The Millbrook Inn occupied a restored Victorian mansion on the town square, its dining room filled with antiques and the kind of understated elegance Caroline had always admired. I arrived 10 minutes early and claimed a table with a clear view of the entrance, positioning myself with my back to the wall, an old habit from construction sites where you learn to watch for trouble coming from any direction. Ethan arrived first, looking haggard in a way that confirmed everything Marcus had discovered about his financial situation. His suit was expensive, but showed wear at the cuffs and collar. His hair needed cutting, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent calculating debts and deadlines. Madison followed close behind, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed around the edges. She wore the same cream-colored coat from their visit to my house, but now I could see the small stains and worn spots that suggested it was her only good coat, carefully maintained but showing its age. Behind them came the reinforcements. Gerald and Patricia Monroe, dressed as if for a board meeting rather than a family lunch. Gerald carried a leather portfolio that probably contained whatever legal documents they thought would intimidate me into compliance. Patricia's expression suggested she viewed this meeting as an unpleasant but necessary task, like putting down a sick animal. They approached my table with the careful choreography of people who'd rehearsed their strategy. Ethan took the seat directly across from me, while Madison sat to his right. Gerald and Patricia flanked them like bookends, creating a wall of family solidarity against the stubborn old man who refused to see reason. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice carrying forced warmth, "thank you for agreeing to meet with us. We really think we can work this out if we all approach it with open minds." I said nothing, waiting for them to reveal their hand. Gerald cleared his throat and opened his portfolio. "Richard, we've been consulting with some professionals about your situation. Estate planners, elder care specialists, people who understand the complexities of family transitions." "What kind of transitions?" "The kind that happen when someone reaches a stage of life where they might benefit from additional support," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she was speaking to a child. "It's nothing to be ashamed of, Richard. We all get older. We all need help eventually." "I see. And these professionals, they've evaluated me personally? They've reviewed the available information," Gerald said carefully. "Your living situation, your social isolation, the challenges of maintaining such a large property at your age. What available information?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see them calculating, trying to determine how much I knew about their investigation, how much they could admit without exposing themselves to legal consequences. Madison jumped into the silence. "Richard, we're not trying to take anything away from you. We're trying to give you something better, a chance to live without the constant worry of home maintenance, property taxes, all the burdens that come with home ownership." "Burdens," I repeated. "Yes," Ethan said, leaning forward earnestly. "Dad, when was the last time you took a real vacation? When was the last time you could travel without worrying about pipes freezing, or the roof leaking, or any of the 100 things that can go wrong with an old house?" I almost smiled at the irony. They were trying to sell me on the benefits of giving up everything I'd worked for by describing the very responsibilities that had given my life meaning and purpose. "The house isn't a burden," I said quietly. "It's my home." "But it could be someone else's home too," Patricia said. "A place where Gerald and I could create new memories while helping you transition to something more manageable." "And where would I be during this transition?" Gerald pulled out a brochure with the kind of slick photography that made institutional living look like a luxury resort. "Clearwater Gardens is really quite nice. Private apartments, meal service, social activities, medical care on site. You'd have community, Richard, people your own age to spend time with." I took the brochure and studied it carefully, noting the carefully staged photographs of smiling seniors engaged in approved activities, craft classes and book clubs and supervised exercise sessions, all designed to keep elderly residents busy and out of the way. "This looks expensive," I said. "Well, yes," Gerald admitted. "Quality care costs money, but that's where the house sale becomes so beneficial. The proceeds would easily cover your expenses for many years. And the remainder would be preserved for Ethan's inheritance, of course, managed properly, invested wisely, protected from the kind of financial mistakes that can happen when people get older and their judgment becomes less reliable." There it was, the real heart of their proposal. They weren't offering to help me transition to a better life. They were offering to warehouse me in institutional care while they liquidated my assets and managed my money for their own benefit. "I see," I said, setting down the brochure. "And if I'm not interested in this transition?" The four of them exchanged glances again, a silent communication that spoke of backup plans and alternative strategies. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice taking on the flush and tone I'd grown to hate, "we have to be realistic about this. You're 73 years old. You live alone in an isolated location. You have a documented heart condition. What happens if you fall? What happens if you have another cardiac episode and there's no one around to help? What happens is I deal with it, the same way I've dealt with everything else in my life." "But why take that risk?" Madison asked. "Why put yourself and your family through the worry when there are safer alternatives?" "Because the alternative you're offering isn't safety. It's imprisonment. The word dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock across their carefully composed faces. "That's not fair," Patricia said sharply. "We're trying to help you." "No," I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "You're trying to help yourselves, and you're using my age and my grief as weapons against me." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a folder I'd prepared that morning. "Since we're being so honest about our intentions, let me share some information with you." I spread documents across the table between us: court records, business filings, property assessments, medical evaluations. The paper trail of their campaign against me, laid out in chronological order for all to see. "Real estate assessors hired without my knowledge," I said, pointing to the first set of documents. "Inquiries to my doctor about my mental health. Surveys of my neighbors about my competence. Attempts to access my banking records. Adult Protective Services called to investigate my living conditions." Each revelation hit them like a physical blow. Ethan's face went pale, Madison's mouth fell open, and Gerald and Patricia looked toward the door as if calculating their escape route. 3 weeks of systematic investigation," I continued, "designed to build a case that I'm not competent to manage my own affairs. All conducted without my knowledge or consent, by people who claim to love me and want what's best for me." "Dad, we can explain," Ethan started. Can you? Can you explain why you hired strangers to evaluate my mental state instead of talking to me directly? Can you explain why you accessed my private medical information without authorization? Can you explain why you involved government agencies in what you claim is a family matter?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Other diners had stopped pretending not to watch, their faces reflecting the fascination people always showed for other families' destruction. "Here's what I think happened," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Gerald and Patricia need a place to live, and they decided my house would solve their problem. Madison thought it was a wonderful idea. Finally, a way to get the inconvenient old father-in-law out of the picture. And you, Ethan, you saw an opportunity to solve your financial problems by forcing the sale of property that isn't yours." "That's not," Madison began. "Isn't it?" I pulled out the final set of documents, Marcus's research into Ethan's business failures and mounting debts. Consulting practice failing, mortgage 3 months behind, civil judgments for unpaid loans. "You're not just wanting my house, son. You're desperate for it." The color drained from Ethan's face as he recognized the court documents, the business filings, the evidence of his financial collapse spread across the table for everyone to see. "How did you—" he started, then stopped himself. "How did I find out about your situation?" "The same way you found out about mine. Public records, professional inquiries, systematic investigation. The difference is, I didn't lie about my reasons or hide behind fake concern for your welfare." Gerald leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is ridiculous. We're offering you a perfectly reasonable solution to a difficult situation. You should be grateful." "Grateful," I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. "For being forced out of my own home so you can live in it rent-free while I rot in institutional care." "No one said anything about rent-free," Patricia started. "Didn't you?" I pulled out one more document, a rental agreement I'd had Helen Crawford draft that morning. "If you want to live in my house, here are my terms. Market rate rent, paid monthly in advance, a lease that can be terminated with 30 days notice, security deposit equal to 3 months rent, professional property management to handle maintenance and repairs, with all costs deducted from your rent payments." I slid the document across the table to Gerald, watching his face as he read the financial terms. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "The rent alone would be nearly $3,000 a month. That's what lakefront property costs in this market. But don't worry, I'm sure your daughter and son-in-law will be happy to help with the payments. After all, family means supporting each other, doesn't it?" The rental terms had the desired effect. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances that spoke of budgets stretched beyond breaking, of retirement savings that couldn't support the lifestyle they'd envisioned. Madison looked stricken as she calculated what this would mean for their already strained finances. But it was Ethan's reaction that surprised me most. Instead of anger or desperation, his face showed something closer to relief. The expression of a man who had been carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders and had finally been given permission to set it down. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. For all of it. For the investigation, for the lies, for trying to take something that belongs to you. Are you? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Both, probably. But mostly I'm sorry I became someone who could do this to his own father. The admission hung in the air between us, more honest than anything that had been said so far. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of the boy he'd once been. The one who had cried when he accidentally stepped on a bug. Who'd told me I was the strongest man in the world. The house stays with me, I said. I know. And this campaign of yours, the assessments, the investigations, the legal threats, it stops now. I know. Gerald slammed his hand on the table, causing silverware to rattle and other diners to turn in our direction. This is insane. We have rights here, legal options. Actually, you don't. I pulled out the final document, the trust paperwork that had transferred ownership of my house beyond their reach. As of last Monday, the property belongs to the Richard Dalton Family Trust. I'm the trustee, which means I control everything. But even if you somehow managed to have me declared incompetent, you couldn't force a sale without going through probate court, which would require proof of financial necessity and judicial oversight of any proceeds. Gerald stared at the trust documents as if they were written in a foreign language. You can't do this. I already have. That money, that property, it's supposed to be part of Ethan's inheritance. Someday, maybe, if I choose to leave it to him. But right now, today, it's mine. And it will remain mine for as long as I choose to keep it that way. Patricia found her voice finally. You're destroying this family over pride and stubbornness. No, I said, standing to leave. You're destroying this family by treating me like an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be respected. I left money on the table for my coffee and walked toward the door. Behind me, I could hear Madison's voice, urgent and confused, asking questions Ethan couldn't answer. Other diners had stopped pretending not to watch, their faces reflecting the mixture of fascination and discomfort that always accompanied public family drama. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean, carrying the promise of snow. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and the aftershock of 40 years of parental love finally reaching its limit. Through the restaurant window, I could see them still sitting at the table, engaged in what looked like heated discussion. Gerald was gesturing angrily, while Patricia shook her head in dismay. Madison appeared to be crying, her careful composure finally cracking under the weight of her husband's revelations. Ethan sat slumped in his chair, staring at the trust documents as if they contained the ruins of all his plans. I started the engine and drove home slowly, taking the long way around the lake. The water was dark today, reflecting the gray November sky like polished steel. Ice was forming along the shoreline in delicate patterns that would be gone by afternoon, but would return each night, growing stronger until the lake was locked in winter's grip. At home, I poured myself a glass of water and sat in Caroline's chair, looking out at the lake that had been our constant companion for 32 years. The confrontation was over, but I felt no sense of victory. If anything, I felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of me and could never be replaced. The phone rang, Ethan's number. I let it go to the machine. Dad, please, we need to talk. I know I screwed up, but please call me back. I erased the message without saving it. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called, its voice wild and mournful. The first snowflakes of the season began to fall outside my window, dusting the world in white. I had won this battle. The house would remain mine. The trust would protect it from future manipulation, and the documentation I'd gathered would prevent any successful legal challenge to my competency. But victory felt suspiciously like loss. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd loved unconditionally for 37 years, was gone. In his place was a stranger who saw me not as a father, but as an asset to be liquidated when convenient. I sat in the gathering darkness, listening to the snow tap against the windows and the profound silence of a house that had once been filled with love, but now held only the echo of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Ethan would likely make more desperate attempts to salvage his situation. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had built together. It would have to be enough, because it was all I had left. The snow fell for 3 days straight after our confrontation at the Millbrook Inn, the kind of early winter storm that transforms the landscape overnight. By Tuesday morning, Clearview Lake was a study in black and white, dark water surrounded by snow-covered pines, the dock buried under drifts that would remain until spring. I stood at the kitchen window with my morning coffee, watching the world wake up to winter, and realized something had changed in me during those 3 days of silence. The anger that had sustained me through weeks of investigation and legal maneuvering was gone, replaced by something quieter but more permanent: acceptance. The phone had rung 17 times since Saturday. I'd let every call go to the machine, listening to increasingly desperate messages from Ethan, increasingly angry ones from Gerald, and one from Madison that simply said, "I'm sorry, Richard," for all of it. But it was the message that came Tuesday morning that finally made me pick up the phone. "Mr. Dalton, this is James Morrison from First National Bank. I'm calling about your son's mortgage situation. We've been trying to reach him for several weeks, and his employment verification lists you as a family reference. If you could give us a call back." I deleted the message and immediately called Marcus. "They're losing the house," I told him. "The bank is calling me as a family reference." "Foreclosure proceedings move fast once they start," Marcus said. "Your son's probably got 60 days, maybe less, before they're evicted." "And then what?" "Then they're homeless, all of them. Ethan, Madison, her parents, wherever they're living now, they won't be living there much longer." I hung up and walked through my house, seeing it with new eyes. 7 bedrooms, most of them unused since Caroline's death. A guest wing I'd built with grandchildren in mind, empty now for 20 years. Space enough for a dozen people to live comfortably, if they were willing to treat each other with basic respect. But respect was exactly what had been missing from our family equation. Ethan had seen me as an obstacle rather than a person. Gerald and Patricia had seen my property as their salvation rather than my home. Madison had seen an opportunity to solve inconvenient problems rather than a chance to build genuine family bonds. Still, they were family. Flawed, manipulative, desperate family, but family nonetheless. And Caroline wouldn't have wanted me to watch them become homeless, no matter what they'd done to me. That afternoon, I called Helen Crawford, the estate attorney who had helped me set up the trust. "I want to add a provision," I told her, "something that would allow family members to live in the house under specific conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "The kind that would protect me from future manipulation while still providing shelter for people who need it." We spent the 2 hours crafting language that would achieve exactly that. A family residence clause that allowed blood relatives to live in the house rent-free, but only under strict conditions. No guests without my permission. No alterations to the property without my written consent. Monthly financial disclosure to ensure they weren't planning more schemes behind my back. And most importantly, immediate eviction for any attempt to force my removal from my own home. "It's generous," Helen said as we finished. "More generous than they deserve, given what they tried to do to you." "It's not about what they deserve," I said. "It's about what Caroline would have wanted me to do." Thursday morning, I called Ethan. He answered on the first ring, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Dad?" "I heard about the foreclosure." Silence stretched across the line. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you—" "Never mind." "Yes. We've got until the 15th to vacate. That's 3 weeks. 3 weeks to find some place we can afford on no income with destroyed credit. Gerald's Social Security won't cover a decent apartment, and my consulting business is basically dead. I don't know what we're going to do." I could hear the defeat in his voice, the sound of a man who'd run out of options and was facing the consequences of his choices. Part of me felt vindicated. This was what happened when you tried to manipulate and intimidate people who'd spent 40 years learning to stand their ground. But a larger part felt something closer to grief. "There's a solution," I said finally. "What do you mean?" "You and Madison, Gerald and Patricia, you can live here." The silence that followed that was so complete I wondered if the line had gone dead. "Dad, I don't understand." "I've had the trust modified to include a family residence provision. You can live in the house rent-free, all of you, as long as you follow certain rules." "What rules?" I outlined the conditions Helen and I had established, watching through my kitchen window as a red-winged blackbird landed on Caroline's bird feeder. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was offering sanctuary to the same people who'd tried to force me from my home just weeks earlier. "Why?" Ethan asked when I finished. "After everything we did to you, why would you offer this?" "Because you're still my son. Because Gerald and Patricia are elderly people who need shelter. Because Madison doesn't deserve to be homeless because of choices she didn't make. And because it's what Mom would have wanted, he said quietly. And because it's what Mom would have wanted. Another long silence. The conditions you mentioned, the financial disclosure, the restrictions on guests and alterations, those aren't negotiable. Nothing about this is negotiable. You either accept the terms exactly as stated, or you find somewhere else to live. Can I have some time to discuss this with Madison and her parents? You have until Friday. If you haven't decided by then, the offer expires. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to process what I'd just done. 3 weeks ago, these same people had tried to steal my home from me. Now I was offering to share it with them. The decision felt simultaneously generous and foolish, charitable and naive. But it also felt like the kind of choice Caroline would have made. Complicated, risky, guided more by love than logic. Friday afternoon brought a knock on my door. I opened it to find Ethan standing alone on my porch, looking older than his 37 years. His expensive suit had been replaced by jeans and a flannel shirt, clothes that made him look more like the boy who'd helped me build the tire swing than the man who'd tried to steal my house. "We accept," he said without preamble, "all of us. Your terms, your conditions, your rules. You understand that this is temporary, that you're guests in my home, not tenants with rights? We understand. You understand that any attempt to manipulate or pressure me will result in immediate eviction? We understand." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but all I saw was exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. "When do you need to be out of your current place?" "Monday." "Then you can start moving in this weekend." He nodded and turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at me. "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I don't know," I said. "What you did, the lies, the manipulation, the complete disregard for my feelings, that's not something I can just forget. But living together might give us a chance to figure out if there's anything left to rebuild. And if there isn't, then at least you'll have a roof over your head while you get back on your feet." Saturday morning brought the first moving truck. I watched from my kitchen window as Gerald and Patricia supervised the unloading of furniture and boxes, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from losing everything you thought was permanent. Madison directed traffic with quiet efficiency, her usual polish replaced by the practical focus of someone who'd learned that survival mattered more than appearances. Ethan worked alongside the movers, carrying boxes and furniture with the careful attention of a man who understood that this was charity, not entitlement. When he caught me watching from the window, he raised his hand in a tentative wave. I nodded back. Not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. By Sunday evening, they were settled into the guest wing I'd built 20 years ago with such hope for grandchildren and holiday gatherings. The irony was bitter. The family I had dreamed of was finally living in my house, but they were here as refugees from their own poor choices, rather than beloved relatives sharing in my good fortune. That first week was awkward beyond description. We moved around each other like actors on a stage. Everyone overly polite, everyone careful not to touch the raw wounds that had brought us to this strange arrangement. Gerald and Patricia kept to their rooms mostly, emerging only for meals they ate in silence. Madison made elaborate efforts to be helpful, cleaning and organizing with the desperate energy of someone trying to earn their place. Ethan worked on his laptop in the study, making phone calls and sending emails in what I assumed was an attempt to rebuild his consulting practice. I maintained my routines: morning coffee at the kitchen table, afternoon work in the garage, evening reading in Caroline's chair. But the house felt different now, filled with other people's conversations and concerns, other people's presence pressing against the solitude I'd grown accustomed to. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after they'd moved in. I was working late in the garage, sanding a piece of cherry wood I'd been saving for a project I couldn't quite visualize, when Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Can I help?" he asked. I almost said no, but something in his voice, a tentative humility I remembered from his childhood, made me reconsider. "You can hold this steady while I finish the edges," I said, gesturing to the board I'd been working on. We worked in silence for 20 minutes, the familiar rhythm of shared labor slowly dissolving some of the tension between us. When we finished, Ethan ran his hand over the smooth wood surface with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. "What are you making?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Sometimes you have to prepare the materials first, then wait to see what they want to become." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Like people, maybe." "Maybe." We put away the tools together, another small step towards something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite estrangement either. As we walked back to the house, Ethan stopped and looked out at the lake, where moonlight painted silver paths across dark water. "I remember helping you build the dock," he said. "I was maybe 10 years old, and you let me use the hammer for the first time. I was so proud when you said I had good hands for construction work." "You did have good hands. Still do, probably. I should have used them for building instead of trying to tear things down." The admission hung in the cold air between us, honest and painful and necessary. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't too late, that hands that had learned to build could learn to build again. But forgiveness couldn't be rushed, and trust had to be earned through actions, not words. "The wood will be ready when you are," I said instead. "There's always another project waiting." Inside, the house was quiet, except for the grandfather clock, counting down another day in our strange new arrangement. Gerald and Patricia had gone to bed early, as had become their habit. Madison was reading in the living room, curled up in the chair Caroline used to favor for her mysteries. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, processing the day's small progress. Ethan and I had worked together without arguing. Madison had contributed to the household without being asked. Gerald and Patricia had remained polite and undemanding. It wasn't the family harmony Caroline had dreamed of, but it was something. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world clean and quiet as under its white blanket. Spring would come eventually, melting the ice and revealing whatever lay beneath. But for now, winter held everything in its patient grip, forcing us all to move more slowly, to consider our steps more carefully, to appreciate the warmth we found wherever we could find it. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking another day in a story that was still being written. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and small victories, new opportunities to build something better from the pieces of what had been broken. But tonight, for the first time since Caroline's death, my house was full of family again. Complicated, flawed, damaged family, but family nonetheless. It wasn't the ending I'd expected when this all began, but maybe it was the beginning of something better. The snow continued to hold the world in its quiet embrace, and somewhere in that silence, I found a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Not the peace of forgiveness, that was still too far away, but the peace of possibility, and for now, that was enough. "Dan tiu." In the distance, a loon called across the frozen lake, its voice carrying across the water, like a reminder that some things endure through even the harshest winters. Some things wait patiently for spring, knowing that what seems dead might only be sleeping, and that what seems broken might still find a way to grow toward the light.